We are live. Awesome. I am Father James, and this is Barely Protestant, and I have my guest today, John Fisher 2.0. And we have a shorter name for that. Should I just say John?
Just John.
Okay.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to say JF20, but then I keep switching to JP2.
Well, in my head, I decided to come today because the last debate we did, which we are going to talk about, you called me Beanie Boy in the comments section, so I'm a little hesitant to wear the beanie now. It sucks. My basement is cold. There's a reason why I record with my hat on.
You can have your hat on, Beanie Boy. It's fine. So yeah, we are going to be doing a review and just a talk about the debate that we did. I personally think we both did a very admirable job. I think it went well, very smoothly. There were some sort of, I think, misunderstandings, which we'll get into. But yeah, how do you think it went?
Oh, I definitely want. I'm kidding. No. That's for the audience to decide. I have my opinion about the matter. I actually think it was too close to call, if you're going to ask me. But I'll say this much: I did think we both had a pretty good opening. I think it would have been a little better if we did get our, how should I put it, our responses down as well. I think we sent it to each other ahead of time, but we didn't have enough time to write a formal response.
That was my fault. I'm gonna totally own that. That's my fault. I just work and everything just gets in the way.
That is true, but to be fair, you actually have responsibilities, so you can be excused. Whereas I don't have that excuse, so I'm not going to hold you to a higher stand. So I'm going to not hold you to too higher a standard. But I'll say this much:
you're too busy playing video games.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm not doing anything. I'm not trying to grow this channel or guest star or book people. But in any case, so the Q&A actually was the best part, both parts, because it allowed for two things: elaboration, and it also allowed for it also allowed us to really critically examine one another, which was very helpful and kind of elucidated the positions. Now, the only drawback to the Q&A sections is sometimes you're a little busy thinking of how you're going to respond, as well as trying to comprehend what the other person is saying. It really requires a lot of brain power. So sometimes misunderstandings can happen. And right after you pointed out, some misunderstandings did happen when I actually went to talk about it with Alan on his channel. And I'd hate to think that I would willfully misrepresent you. And thankfully, you're charitable enough not to come to that conclusion. So in part, we're going to clarify some misunderstandings that might have took place between our positions as well. And I think by getting that out of the way, it'll help us be more critical of our debating.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that one of the things I think that is important is that when I see sort of evidence among two relatively intelligent people sort of being discussed, looking at the same passage and sort of interpreting it differently, the thing that immediately comes to mind is, well, there are different presuppositions at work. So what are sort of the presuppositions, as charitable as possible, that you think that are different for us to approach? And we'll do this part at the end, but the three big passages, I would say, or three of the big passages, which are Isaiah 22, Matthew 16, and Matthew 18.
And to a lesser extent, but we did touch on it, Luke 22:32.
Yeah, we will touch on that in a bit as well.
Right. So this is why I really liked analyzing it in the sense that Swinburne actually distinguished between evidence and background knowledge, because the background suppositions actually help you try to get out in the open as much as what you're bringing into the text. And I brought in, the unity of Scripture, the harmony between doctrines of the faith, as well as how well it coalesces and is exemplified in the living tradition. Now, the last one was a little tricky because this is one that kind of verged on breaking or being within bounds of the rules. And I think we are both very hesitant about whether or not to even admit looking at the text in light of that sort of evidence, although you were a much better sport about it than you needed to be. I think if you took the opposite conclusion and said, I don't want you bringing that up, I feel uncomfortable, I don't think you're really you're really within your rule set, I would have understood that too. But I'm glad we also got that out of the way. Now, the interesting thing is, though, even when you look at church tradition, you could bring in a different set of presuppositions as well. But I think the general point is when you get that stuff out in the open, it's a good thing. And I was just showcasing why I was reading the scripture in the way I was and using those kinds of metrics. So those would be the three I would have brought in. Now, a few things to keep in mind as well. I am actually reading Pastor Eternus, and I am using that as a teaching aid for myself, because when you learn from your authority, and of course an authority isn't just like an institution, like when you're in a school and you're being taught, your professor is your authority. When you're in any kind of environment where you're submitting yourself to someone else's superiority or background knowledge, that is also your authority in a sense. Now, the difference is mine is binding my conscience in faith and will, but I have to try to let go as much of that as possible. But at the same time, I still want to make a good case for the teaching I'm representing, and that's what I'm bringing into my reading. However, I'm only using an evidential case because I don't think I could like deduce every little bit of aspect of Pastor Eternus, and I was trying to be straightforward with that. I don't think I could have built up my case deductively, just looking at each piece of the text and saying, oh, this is definitely teaching what Pastor Eternus is saying. I have to read it in light of my weights of measurement, and I have to make sure the other person is okay with that. And if not, I have to give some further justifications for it. So that's how I would approach it in terms of my background knowledge as my presuppositions. And that's how I would also approach looking at these verses in light of Pastor Eternus. Now, I just want to emphasize something else. You yourself are coming in with presuppositions too.
Of course, yeah.
Right. And I know you acknowledge this. And this is in light of your background, because you were never, you are an Anglican, and the Anglicans put a much higher weight on tradition than your background as a Baptist. Throughout your life, though, you have always been, you've always had a lot more liberty when interpreting the text than I would have had. So I feel like your presuppositions and your back wouldn't be as affected, and you have a little more room for interpretation, whereas I don't. And I recognize that has some sort of benefit, but at the same time, I would also say that sometimes having a bit too much liberty might be a bad thing as well. And that's why we're here to investigate the case itself. Does the liberty you have, which enables you to look at other options, does that outweigh any benefit of my authority when I look at the scripture? And this is where debate shines, because you could actually critically appraise that. So what do you think?
Yeah, that is interesting. So for me, in my everyday life, I sort of, whenever I'm debating something, I try to give the strongest arguments against something within my own mind and place it against the strongest arguments for it. And I have that sort of inner debate, and I'm very big on playing devil's advocate within my own mind on a variety of issues. And I don't know if that's quite the approach that you take. And obviously, I don't think we could actually like measure that in any sort of external way.
Actually, I could comment on that. So there's a reason why I don't come in guns a-blazing and say that, oh yeah, like the teaching of papal primacy from Scripture, oh, that's deductively proven, just like let's say the Trinity. I think it's a lot easier to come to the knowledge of the divinity of Christ, or the divinity of the three persons being distinct in person but one in substance from Scripture. I think that is more or less there. Maybe without words like homoousios being present, you could at least make that deduction. Whereas I don't think you can make that strong case, which is why I think you make the strongest case, but at the same time, you give it the appropriate amount of weight for the person you're dialoguing with. So that's why I'm very critical in my methodology, as well as humble enough to show what I can and can't prove in light of Scripture.
No, my only point was to a more general principial one. My point is the approach to debate itself, where within debate, where I try to have the debate within my own mind and say, okay, what are the strongest arguments that I could have, and then like what would I debate if I were on the other side?
I see. So out of curiosity, do you think I made the strongest claim somebody on the opposite side could have made? Or do you think
no. My point is to sort of like hash that out within my own mind, and then it's sort of like Hegel's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's the dialectics.
I understand, but my question is, how did I compare to the inner voice in your mind? That's what I'm asking.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can really answer. I have to think about that for a bit. Part of it was like, for instance, with one of the things that I wasn't expecting, and this was because I just didn't have a chance to actually like look through it in detail, was concerning the Septuagint, which like the primary line of the Septuagint doesn't have the thing of that. But then I also the thing that actually made me stop pursuing that line was actually when you talked about the Latin and it being in the Latin. And for me, I'm looking within the stream that the Romans have, like the Latin is not necessarily inspired translation, but it's authoritative.
So I'll say this. So could I actually tell you something about that? So recently, the Vatican did release what's called the Nova Vulgata, which is the new Latin translation. And basically, we use this instead of the traditional Vulgate, which you could find online. So we can update that authoritative text. And something else to keep in mind: it's only free of theological error. It's not free of translational error. So, for example, if you read it, you're not going to come to any theological error if you properly understood it. However, it doesn't mean that everything in there is going to be linguistically accurate. So, for example, if I translate "this is a lime" as "this is an apple," that's a mistranslation, but it's not heretical or theologically erroneous.
It's definitely heretical. No.
But
hey, if you can have the phrase for the office of a priest not in it out of like 24 times in the entire liturgy where it says referral to the priest, and it be a theological error, no, I'm not going to rehash that debate.
I won't pursue that one any further, but I will say this much. These things can delve into a huge amount of minutia. So I really don't blame you for being frustrated with the process. Even I grow frustrated with going into a deep theological process. I bet, for example, when you have to provide some kind of understanding for why you take a more Anglo-Catholic position, despite the fact that one of the 39 articles might say something in tension with it, you might find that frustrating to a certain extent, but you're willing to, at the very least, go through all that to show harmony between you and the communion you've adopted.
Yeah, the only I guess you could say I have problems with two articles. One is more significant than the other, I would say. What is it? Article 29, I think, is the one that I have the most issue with, where it talks about the really it's just the title that I have the problem with, because they quote St. Augustine and they say that that the wicked are not partakers of Christ in the sacrament or something like that, which I would agree with. I just think that they're still eating his flesh and drinking his blood.
I mean, so, you could say what Cardinal Newman said about it, or at the time,
track 90.
Okay. Well, I mean, track 90 doesn't. Well, you could just track. Well, if you're going to track 90, some of it, you could just think, well, yeah, how about we understand that article in light of what St. Augustine says, and not what the writer of the article said St. Augustine said.
Pusey said it better. Pusey says more or less the same thing, much better. He's like, I'm going to take St. Augustine's understanding of it better than the title. Like, the title is the thing that actually seems to be out of line with the rest of the Anglican formularies. And on top of that, it's inconsistent with St. Augustine himself. So that was his point. Well,
to be fair, Pusey was building on Newman. I mean, his defense of track 90.
Much better than Newman. Oh, much better than Newman, I would say. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
All I'm saying, come on, give Newman some credit. All right.
He died. That's something good.
I would be mad about that. But I remember Newman once asked the Roman Catholic he was learning under if he felt that there was anything good about Cranmer, and the person responded, "Well, he burned well."
Oh, wow.
So okay. All right.
Let's move on to some of these things. Yeah. So if you could clarify the evidence versus background knowledge part, because
Oh, right.
I
Yeah.
don't see a distinction that is substantial. Like,
Mhm.
so the thing is, I see a difference that you're making with that, but I don't see how it wouldn't constitute as evidence.
Oh, okay. Think about it like this. For a standard
Well,
syllogism.
first preface it with saying what for the audience, like what
Right.
we are talking about. Yeah.
All right. So, according to Richard Swinburne, he makes this distinction, and to be fair, in his book, he actually says that background.
Sorry. First, talk about why we're talking about background, like
All
the
right.
verse,
So,
Isaiah 22. Yeah.
all right. So, background evidence is so background knowledge and evidence are distinct in this way. When you're talking about background knowledge, you're talking about how you look at evidence, and when you're talking about evidence, you're saying this is going to be in favor of what you're saying. It's in favor of the truth of that you're claiming. So, for example, let's say for instance, there's Jones, and he is said to be on trial for murdering Smith. Now, let's say that there's a
Sorry, real quick one. Just so the people who are watching know, we're talking about Isaiah 22 and what Alan was talking about. Like he was confused
right.
about how.
Oh,
Yeah, I just want that clear because So I'm pointing to a particular part of the debate, the part about Isaiah
right.
22 connecting to Matthew
Okay.
16:18. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, yeah, I'm just going to give this example first, and just to tell you guys what background evidence is, and then I'll apply it to the Isaiah assessment. So let's say there's a case where Smith is on trial for murdering Jones. Now, we know for a fact that Smith's fingerprints are at the crime scene. So why do we know that that's evidence? Well, because we have the background knowledge that human fingerprints are very rare, and it would be very hard for Smith's fingerprints to just end up there happenstantially. So it raises the probability overall that Smith is the killer. So would we say that the rarity of background, the rarity of fingerprints and how unique they are to every individual is in and of itself evidence that Smith is the one who killed Jones? Well, no, that we just know that in light of that knowledge, the fact that his fingerprints are there is going to constitute evidence. So how do we apply this to Isaiah and Matthew? Quite simply, when we look at some sort of interpretation for a passage, we also have to ask ourselves, is this interpretation more likely considering the fact it makes other verses clearer or more obscure? By understanding Matthew 16 verse 18 in the same way that Pastor Eternus does, suddenly Isaiah chapter 22 becomes a lot clearer because it has a kind of application to Peter's role as minister in the New Testament, rather than me saying, oh, well, look at this is Isaiah. This is saying that there's always going to be a minister in the house of David who serves the king first over every and all other people in the kingdom. Therefore, we could expect this in Matthew chapter 6 in the new covenant with Peter. So I'm not saying that in itself is evidence. I'm saying, given our background knowledge of that verse being in Scripture, and that making more sense in light of Pastor Eternus's reading, we could say that the weight of this reading should grow. So, for example, would you say the fact that I used this kind of example before? We understand that Christ is king. He has, and he is also God. So he is both king and God at the same time. So if we have that sort of understanding, suddenly there's actually a bit more sense when it comes to Kings and First Kings, and also what was that? Also the last book of Judges, because one seems to be very anti-monarchy and the other seems to be very pro-monarchy. Well, when you read Christ in that way, then those verses just make a lot more sense, especially if you read him as a divine figure. So in light of that, I'd say that any reading of Christ being divine, as well as the Messiah, should actually be raised, considering how much clearer certain passages are made in light of that. In fact, so much of the Old Testament is made clear because we understand Christ, because we understand those verses in a Christological sense. And I'd say that even though that in itself wouldn't constitute evidence, like I wouldn't show that to a Jew and say, therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. I would say, in light of how much sense the Old Testament makes with Christ, I'd say that our interpretation of the messianic passages as pointing to Christ should have a lot more weight. So, does that clarify things?
Yeah, it does. But I do have a question. So, Alan brought this up in the review that you guys did, and I was sort of confused at what he was saying. Was he, because the parameters were within the Old and New Testament, and I would have allowed, obviously, for the Deuterocanonical segment at all, even if you want to go east, and add their books as well. But was it because of the sort of historical background of Eliakim himself? Like, are there extra biblical sources that he was questioning about? Because he was talking about, I was confused by that part. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what part specifically. I'm sorry, that was like 2 days ago, and my mind is in a bit of a haze because I was kind of enamored with a side project. But I don't think I cited anything extra biblical outside of Isaiah. Although for other things I did, obviously, with Leo's tome. But I would not have cited anything else, not to my recollection, with Hezekiah. But I would say that
Eliakim, you mean?
Eliakim, yes. My apologies. I would not say that there's anything extra biblical two-way in light of that. I think that the only thing I'd say is it makes better sense when you read Matthew in the Catholic context than when you read him in a lesser context. And by lesser, I don't mean like wrong. I just mean in a lower place of Peter as just having a supremacy of honor, not a supremacy of office.
Okay. Yeah, because I was confused by when he said that. I was like, well, I was confused by your response a little bit. But I think part of it was because due to the fact that I was confused at him bringing up like the idea that I wouldn't use it as evidence. He was saying.
I see.
Yeah.
He wouldn't. Oh, I see. Yeah. So I wouldn't use it as evidence in the sense that I would not use Isaiah 22. And so I would not use Isaiah.
I've got it clarified now. Okay. Yeah.
I would not say. Yeah. It's like if we go back to that equation, I would not say that on its own it constitutes evidence because even just pointing out, putting Matthew chapter 16 out of it completely. Someone could say hypothetically that this shows that there has to be somebody like Peter because of the fact that there was somebody like this in the Old Testament. Yeah, I would not use that sort of.
So my confusion was the whole evidence part, and for some reason I was just thinking like he was talking about that we were only looking at Scripture, so that's why I got confused. Okay.
Right.
All right. So next one. Unless you had anything else to say for.
Yeah, actually, could I ask you something?
Yeah.
Because right. So I was actually a bit confused with this part, and we clarified this a little before it started. You brought in the notion of faith and morals not actually being in the text itself, and in the interview portion I said, well, who cares? Like you could honestly just read that as it's supporting the higher viewpoint of like an ultramontanism. And a fortiori, it would prove Pastor Eternus by going above it. Now, but I don't think you were making that sort of argument. I think you were saying something else. Would you mind clarifying that?
Yeah, so I was saying like something that encompasses. It doesn't have to be only faith and morals. Encompasses, and it can be implied to some degree at least. But I mean, to be sort of weird, it could be technically like you will never infallibly. Or you will never fallibly pick the next person to be leader, but that doesn't mean that what that person or what you say is infallible in faith and morals.
Oh, I see.
So like there's a bunch of different sort of infallible options there. That like if you're going to presume, or not necessarily presume, but if you're going to claim that there's an infallible ability, it doesn't necessarily have to be faith and morals. It could be a whole number of things. Now, if it encompasses faith and morals and all these other things, well, sure. that includes it. Yeah.
So for example, you'll be infallible, but when it comes to, I don't know, Christological claims, like
Christological, explicitly
yeah.
Christological claims or ecclesiastical claims,
Right.
about like the structure of the church or something like that.
Right. That would go beyond what you would want, but that would underrepresent what I would want. Or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this microphone.
So, no worries. So yeah, that was what I was saying. And then he made a comment that I was I'm trying to remember. So something to the effect that I didn't know what ultramontanism is.
Did Alan say
I don't
that?
know. Yeah, he said like Father James didn't know what ultramontanism is. I guess maybe because I was confused. I know he corrected me on a confusion I had about ultramontanism.
That might have been it. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe he just, it was a slip of the tongue. Maybe he could have said it in the sense of he didn't have a proper understanding of ultramontanism, or he had a misconception about it. That would have been a more charitable way.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
And fair enough. I think there are a lot of things we could all say that are more charitable at times. Sometimes you get caught on with the camera, but I think that was kind of the point. Although, to be fair, you clarified you had some understanding of what ultramontanism is after our podcast. You actually showed a book on ultramontanisnism.
I have it here still. The O'Malley book. Is it John O'Malley? I keep saying Tim O'Malley for some reason. I have. Oh, it's falling. That's okay. I have a mess of a bookshelf.
Right. Well,
it was a good one.
Although to specify, for that, I think Alan would probably be someone better to talk to about what he would have said. I don't want to get between you guys. And to be fair,
I don't think he meant in any sort of dishonest way. I was just confused by that. Like, I know we had a conversation where he corrected a misunderstanding I had about ultramontanism.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, to be fair, like ultramontanism is something which was never formally defined. It was always just a bunch of theologians who had much bigger ideas of what the papacy encompassed, other than what was specified in the First Vatican Council. Some didn't even think the Pope could err as a private theologian.
Okay. They never met Pope Francis. Sorry.
There have been worse popes even before Vatican.
Alexander VI. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of theology, like Pope Honorius, I would definitely say he erred as a private theologian.
I don't think you can say otherwise, honestly. Yeah.
Some have tried to make
it's hard to argue. Yeah.
Some have tried to argue that the letter was a forgery, but like here's the thing: even when ecumenical councils condemn somebody, like Origen was condemned by name, by his theology. There are some people who, David Bentley Hart, not naming names, who try to say that, Origen wasn't really condemned. No, when the church condemns you, you are condemned. You could be very certain about that, because it's like we trust the church to rightfully declare and canonize saints. Like, if you don't think it has the power to rightfully condemn and anathemize people, then, especially in the context of an ecumenical council of all things, I really don't know how you take that position.
Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense. Moving on. So the Vatican II and Vatican I thing, maybe I didn't clarify what I was talking about with the initial debate. So what happened was in the debate review that you guys did, you seemed to be under the impression that I wasn't, not purposefully, but sort of showing this idea that Vatican I and Vatican II were opposed to each other when it came to the papal claims.
Yes.
My point was good.
Or that someone might get that impression.
Yeah. My point was actually the sort of opposite of that. I was trying to show, even to people who were like, well, no, we have Vatican II now and it makes it softer than what, I guess you could say, quote, misinterpretations of Vatican I would be. My point was to show, even if you're a huge Vatican II fan and like you think it like weakens the papacy all this sort of amount, no, look at what the Pope says about Lumen Gentium.
Yeah. I mean, Vatican II actually goes further than Vatican I and actually specifies that the Pope, even when he's not speaking in light of his office and in terms of extraordinary magisterium, you still owe him an assent of will and intellect. Yep. So even if it's not an assent of faith, you kind of can't openly contradict him and stuff. Not naming names. Taylor Marshall.
Yeah, I love Taylor Marshall as a non-Roman Catholic.
Have you ever seen that meme where a set of a contest and basically it's that meme where there's a penguin and it's labeled Anglican and an elephant and it's labeled set of a contest and they have like an elephant penguin baby and it's like Taylor Marshall. He actually saw that meme on one of his live streams and he was like, "This doesn't bother me at all. Make these memes. You're not gonna interfere. It doesn't bother me." I'm like, dude, like, okay, then why do you have it on? Like, it
clearly bothers you because you're talking about it.
Yeah, and like the claim isn't he's a set of a contest, of course not. It's just that it's just that he comes from an Anglican background and yet he's using these like ultra trad talking points at the same time. Yeah. So that's why it's like this weird mix.
Yeah. So just to clarify, I wasn't trying to show like some sort of like I feel like if I were trying to do that, that would be me sort of trying to, I guess, poison the well almost.
Yeah, but I do want to clarify. Yeah. But I do want to clarify something. If I could get that misinterpretation, you might understand how a viewer might get that misinterpretation. So that's also why I wanted to clarify. But I also thought it was very important because it also defines the roles of the bishops in relation to the Pope as well. And that's another reason why I think it's very helpful to quote Gasser on this one, because he actually predates a lot of the Vatican II stuff in the Relatio itself. And the Relatio is actually considered the authoritative reading on Vatican I. It's not in itself infallible. It's just an authoritative reading. Yeah. And what's really good about the Relatio is this. It connects, it gives the bishops a sense of infallibility as well, which is why a Catholic doesn't necessarily need to be at odds with your reading of Matthew 18:18, which we'll get to in a minute. Only that one cannot subsume the Bishop of Rome's authority only in light of the College of Bishops, which you would say it is actually doable in the context of an ecumenical council, which would be able to revise such a statement by the Pope. I think that would be the only difference between one of the major differences between our two positions.
Yeah, one of them. Yeah. So I guess we can move on to the Isaiah and Matthew passages. So just to clarify, because you were saying like, not in a mean way, but like you're talking about how you didn't say this terminology, but sort of like you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either Matthew 18 is okay, and then therefore Isaiah 22 is okay, or Matthew 18 is not okay, or Isaiah 22 is not okay, but you can't then say Matthew 22
right.
is okay. So that's kind of my position, is what I was more or less saying, but go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So just to clarify that, my only point of emphasis was if assuming, so there was kind of an incongruity about the two arguments that you made with the Septuagint case earlier, which you said you backed off because as soon as I mentioned the Latin stuff, you kind of didn't think that was a good position to go in, because even assuming like a Catholic worldview, and I know you kind of like that presuppositional stuff in our private knowledge, private talks. I was only pointing out the incongruity between making that argument and then making this argument because of the fact that one doesn't mention the keys. Well, you could probably impose it into Matthew 18 and say that should kind of be knocked there. Now, it might be the case that because you don't really see the first position as being tenable in light of the fact that the Septuagint doesn't hold it, but the fact that the Vulgate does. But I think in a debate context, that's actually a good thing to bring up, only for the fact that it kind of clarifies or highlights something about how your interlocutor might be assessing evidence. I'm not saying I was only playing the debate game, but I am saying that if you're going to pointing out an inconsistency can actually help highlight one's position. And I think that's all I was doing there. Now, it might be the case that you no longer think that's a tenable position to have with a Roman Catholic, the fact that the primary source of the Septuagint no longer holds the keys. Therefore, this contention or contradiction no longer applies to you. But I'm saying in the way it was presented to me, that's why I thought it was good to emphasize that that's actually between the two passages. So
yeah, my point with the whole key. So part of the argument that, well, I'm debating whether I should even go into the whole Greek thing, because like it's not quite the position I would hold. Given that, go ahead.
How about this? How about we just discuss our background knowledge in terms of the Old Testament? Would you say that you would put more weight to the Hebrew lineage of the text or the Greek lineage of the text? As a general principle, not necessarily as an absolute.
Yeah, as a general principle, I would put the Greek as a general principle. But that is primarily, actually almost exclusively, I would say maybe, because of the fact that we see the Greek, or the Old Testament verses following the Greek like 90% of the time in the New Testament.
That much is true, although one has to take into account how much overlap there was between the Greek and the Hebrew anyway, and also whether or not the apostles were citing it for the sake of, like some Protestants who take the Hebrew position, Catholics too. I don't know why I'm singling out Protestants. It's an endemic among modern scholars of both our camps. They'll say that, that part of the Septuagint was inspired in the same way that quoting a part of a pagan poet is inspired. Not necessarily the whole thing, but just that one part.
Interesting distinction. Right. Yeah, but I go back and forth on it, honestly, myself. So
I do too. Like I'm not well trained in ancient languages, so I usually give it to the Vulgate because Jerome is just highly regarded in the in our communion. But I would say this much: I think that the best approach is to take the Latin, the Greek, and the Hebrew, compare them like with like, and then see which manuscript tradition and which reading has the heaviest evidence. But in light of what you just said with the Greek reading, I think I understand where you're coming from now. I think your position is, you're no longer taking that line, and it's not really something that should be considered to be a point of inconsistency that I could fairly bring up to you anymore.
Part of it, the big part of it is that it actually, so the Hebrew has the word key in it too, specifically. My bigger issue, but I think this sort of goes back too far from the debate, is, for instance, the Septuagint is drawn from, when it comes to Genesis 3, who bruises who crushes the head of the serpent.
Actually, no. I think actually in the Septuagint it is actually male, not female.
In the Hebrew, it is male. In the Septuagint, my understanding, and I don't have a critical edition of the Septuagint. I really need one, a Septuagint, but I've heard multiple scholars talk about this, where in the Greek, it is more ambiguous, and then in the Latin, it does allow for female. I think it does say she in the Vulgate. I think it did.
Yeah, like Jerome is never really consistent. To be fair, Jerome never has a really consistent one-size-fits-all viewpoint. Sometimes he'll prefer the Septuagint, like he'll translate Proverbs 39 as saying a man in his youth rather than a man and a virgin. But at the same time, he'll also in other times agree with the Masoretic text. So this is actually why Jerome's fairly interesting. He doesn't always take like a Septuagint only approach himself. I mean, if he did do that, there'd really be no point in the Vulgate. But this is why Catholics usually follow him, because we think, this is a man who is both theologically informed and in tune with Catholic doctrine, while at the same time who was very knowledgeable about the languages themselves. And that's why a lot of emphasis is usually given to him. But to just so we don't get too far from this, I think you are right to bring out that sort of inconsistency, but I think that inconsistency is ultimately with Jerome, and only God knows why he chose which manuscript tradition he did. He might have had a very good reason. He might not have, but yeah, I think that's a debate in itself.
Yeah, I just like, it just seems like like it's more about which text fits the theology better, kind of thing. That's what it comes across as? And you can see that, right?
I mean, Jerome's is a theologian too, so
yeah. So, but I think the more important part, though, is sort of how we look at those three passages, which are Isaiah 22, 22:18, right, or 22:22?
22, yeah, 20. Isaiah 22, 20 to 25.
Okay. And then Matthew 16:18, that whole passage, obviously, and then Matthew 18:18. And my point is that if you are taking Matthew 16:18 as a sort of obviously important, which every verse is important, if you're going to take Isaiah 22, and not that you were doing like not that you were being inconsistent here necessarily, but like if one's going to take Isaiah 22, they have to take Isaiah 18 or Matthew 18:18. I think they really have to.
So one critical point I'll make against myself is I didn't really emphasize the congruity between Matthew 18 and Matthew 16 as well as I could have. Like earlier, I actually had a key opportunity, especially in light of distinguishing the extraordinary and the ordinary magisterium. Now, the question would be, after that, we could have debated whether or not we needed to exclude Peter and say he had a special power apart from the other apostles, because that's really what the debate was about. We both agree that there's like an ordinary magisterial power that the church has in light of the College of Bishops, because they're a mirror of the College of Apostles coming together. And then going forward to the extraordinary form where Peter just extends his power himself. We could have talked about, for example, whether as I tried to argue, whether him declaring you are Christ, the Son of the living God, was kind of that sort of exercise. But if anyone wants to see that debate and see how well that argument stands, it speaks for itself. My only point is I could have done that a lot better. And I think I'll hold my feet to the fire and say, it wasn't as well emphasized. I was more or less trying to push away, whereas I think I could have come to what I think is very satisfactory reading.
I'm trying to remember. Was that the part where you were talking about the logical fallacy?
Oh, affirming the consequence?
Yeah, with the affirming the consequent?
Yes.
Because that was the part where we went a little bit around on. Do you still think that I was affirming the consequent there?
Okay, so I think you were doing one of two things.
Okay.
So you were either affirming the consequent, which is what I initially thought. So, for example, if P, just so everyone is aware, if I was to say, if it rains, my street will be wet. It rained, therefore my street is wet. That's a completely valid inference. But if I say,
that's valid. Okay.
Yeah. But if I say it rained, if it rained, my street is wet. Hey, my street is wet, therefore it rained. Well, possible, but and that would be a necessary outcome, but not necessarily. There could have been a dam could have broke and flooded the streets, or a neighbor's hose could have just run on and the streets would have been flooded as a result. Sometimes that happens, but then there's the other kind of inference, the one I said before. It seemed like you were trying to say, for example, if Peter was the wrong, if Peter has the key, therefore he binds and looses. Peter binds and looses, therefore he has the key. That's how I first interpreted you, and that's why I said you were affirming the consequent.
Okay.
Then you switched up and said, if the apostles have the power to bind and loose, then they have the key. They have the power to bind and loose, then they had the key. So so I would not disagree with you that is a necessary criteria of having the key, but it would not be sufficient. However, you think it is sufficient, but I'll clarify. But I think you can make the argument, if I was, and I think I could have been more charitable in this as the debate went on, that, okay, it's not like conclusive, but it is evidential. Like, I'm making an evidential case. Why couldn't I let you make an evidential case? So
that was my position. My point was this: I'm seeing the same formula,
right?
So with the claim that you're making about my Matthew 16:18 with Matthew 18:18,
right.
I'm seeing the thing that you're accusing me of in Isaiah 22 with Matthew 16:18. So, for instance, so
you're saying that so you're using Matthew 16 as background knowledge, or
no. I'm saying I'm holding you to the same standard that you were holding me with. Okay, so the key, there's no office mentioned in Matthew 16:18, right?
Yeah, I was saying the key was a sufficient condition for the office.
Yeah, but let's try through this quickly.
Okay.
So, if office then key, if P then Q in Isaiah 22, Q, key,
Mm.
therefore P in
Okay.
Matthew 16:18. So do you see the issue?
Oh, okay. Yes, I do. Although
Uh-huh.
I don't recall whether or not Isaiah 22 explicitly mentioned an office. Like it mentioned certain powers that came with the key, but I'm not sure if it said office or if
Well, it doesn't have
key.
to say the word office, but like you're referencing an office. Like
Oh, okay.
it's very clear that there is an office there. Like I don't think that's like it doesn't need to strictly say explicitly office. I'm not saying
Right.
that.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, okay, fair enough. I understand where
Uh,
you're coming from. Now,
mhm,
something else to understand though is these verses I have on paper, so I'm not
mhm.
going to just like have a firm memory of
Yeah.
everything
No, no.
those verses are saying.
Mhm,
So it's really hard to just do like a critical assessment of how close those are in terms of
mhm,
pointing out which parts are evidential of an office.
mhm.
So fair enough. It was a bit tricky to get what you were where you were coming
Yeah.
from there, but now
I
that you've explained it, I
uh,
better understand it.
my just to let you know, my debate approach is I look for the same standard on with my debate partner. Like if I see two different sets of standards being done, or if I see something that looks like that,
Mhm.
that's what I'll jump on right away.
Fair enough. And
That's just my mindset. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, I think we both agree with that. Like there was a reason why I cited
Mm,
the portion about Isaiah and the Septuagint with Matthew 18. Like I think we both have that. It's a good strategy. You want to catch your opponent's inconsistencies because
mhm.
sometimes we don't even know where we are inconsistent. This is why
Yeah.
we need checks
Mhm.
and balances here.
So my point was not that Matthew 18:18 proves that Matthew 16 it's referring back to, like, I think there's obviously strong evidence, obviously, I
Mhm.
would say, like
Okay.
I need a good reason to not make that connection, but it doesn't necessarily follow. But if Isaiah 22 or Matthew 16:18 necessarily follows from Matthew 16:8 or from Isaiah 22, that then like we'll then have the same standard with 18:18. That was
Right. So yeah, in the future, I think we'll just have a discussion about whether there is that distinction between extraordinary and ordinary exercise that's made manifest in the text itself, rather than debating whether or not there is any relationship between the two.
Mhm,
I think it's fair to say that that bit of evidence has to be taken into account from the get go,
mhm,
rather than not. And I think that. I think that I was in a better position by pointing out the relatio than if I wasn't at all. But I can't
mhm,
really just trust everyone to make that case or just to make that connection without me doing it explicitly.
mhm.
So,
Um, so one more, and I I didn't bring this up, so if you don't want to comment on it too much, and I'm afraid of this getting too much back into the actual debating itself. Um, so if you don't want to
all
pursue
right.
this, that's fine. But Luke, you were talking about Peter's faith, and um, I, like about 5 or 6 rebuttals came to that when you
Uh,
started pointing to faith
can I
in
just?
Luke 23. Go ahead.
I'm just going to ask you one question. I'll let you
Okay.
clarify what you mean, and we'll end it there.
Okay.
How about that?
Like end the whole stream.
No, no, not the whole stream.
Oh, okay.
Just say your piece, and then we could continue on from here.
Okay.
So when you read, so when we're making the comparison between Peter and Luke versus Judas and the other 12, in the text, Judas is being made the exception. However, Peter is the only party there which the prayer is directed to and couldn't be made an exception. Now, that's how I understood it. What do you think
Mhm.
is wrong with that understanding? And how would you frame the argument better than I just did?
The argument from your perspective.
Yes. Where, from my perspective, did I misunderstand that? Because that's how I understood it.
Well, I wasn't wanting to pursue that part particularly, but so I would say that you could argue that, but I need a positive reason, scripturally or theologically or philosophically,
Mhm.
like other than just saying because if so for as an example, let's say let's presuppose that obviously Jesus did pray for the apostles. Okay,
Right.
um, Jesus could have been praying at one point. I don't think this is unacceptable for just Judas himself, or for just Mark himself. Not Mark. I'm sorry, Peter himself, or just John himself at any one given time. I think that you would have to say that that wouldn't be allowed with that understanding of well, Judas was the exception, but Peter was the only one there. So
yeah, that's a good question. Did Jesus pray for the wicked while in his state as a human being, knowing that they would not use the grace which God would have given them as a result of that prayer?
But then connected to that also, I mean, Hebrews makes it quite clear that Jesus is praying. Well, Jesus is praying for like interceding before the Father. Now there are people he's interceded for who fall away. So I mean, like it just seemed like a very weird defense of it, I guess you could say. And I don't know how I would defend it better, but I honestly I would have just let go of that argument itself. But that wasn't the main one I think, because the question for me is, and I'll let you get to that. I'm not trying to cut you off. But the bigger, well, not bigger, but the other thing for me was that Jesus is praying that your faith not fail for Peter. I think contextually it makes sense that he's talking about within that scenario, not that like I think reading your faith will not fail into that you will have papal infallibility. That's a bit of a stretch.
Not that you will have papal infallibility, that you will be protected from error. Because the failing of the faith is what leads one to error in the office. That's all I was getting at. So yeah, all right. So you're making a few good points here, like because the first point you're making is how do we understand Jesus as interceding while at the same time people falling away? Calvinists seem to reconcile that by saying he's not at all. If you are at the very least going to fall away, Christ doesn't even bother. There's no sense in which you're supported. You're even predetermined. We're both not going to take that position. We're also both, and you're not going to take, once saved, always saved. Peter is always going to persevere, even if he was like a serial killer. So I understand that there are a lot of theological assumptions I didn't take into account, and it's hard to take into account in a debate setting because, that's a very heavy topic. Yeah. Now, but the second part, in terms of how this presents background knowledge, when you understand it when you distinguish between Peter's office and Peter as the person, it kind of makes sense of why he didn't fail. But then but this goes back just to the first issue. Do we even need that hermeneutic in the first place to make things any clearer? And I think that theological point was actually much better than the point about the distinction between the man and the office. That portion comes in only because that scripture needs to be made sense of in light of the harmony and unity of the scripture itself. So that was my only point there. I think it's also hard to get into that issue because it deals a lot with predestination. And to be fair, I don't think a lot of us really have a good understanding of predestination because it's not something the church has ever made a definitive claim about. And I don't even.
I'm a Molinist, so.
Yeah, I don't like that position anymore.
I love Molinism. I love it.
Yeah. In any case, it's better than open theism. I'll give you that.
Definitely.
And it's better than Calvinism. I'll also give you that too.
I'll say that I have to study Calvin a bit more, but we tend to conflate what Calvin actually believed with what John MacArthur believed, and they're not the same.
Well, actually, funny enough, Jonathan Edwards was kind of the guy who got double predestination rolling, as well as compatibilism. I think.
Beza, I would say, but yeah.
No, fair enough. In any case, I think that is going to be I think just from a theological viewpoint, I'm going to have to look into that one a little more. But now I understand where you're coming from. So thank you for that. I think that the Judas verse that you mentioned, well, a good one to consider, might be a little weird because Judas is considered an exception. But I think your citation of just Jesus's mannerisms in general and what we might expect of him as well as like what you allege Hebrews as saying. I'm not sure if Hebrews says it. I know Paul says in very strong terms that he wills the salvation of all.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
But no. A major part of Hebrews is that Jesus is interceding on behalf of us for the Father, and like, is he only interceding for the elect then? In the Augustinian sense, where even regenerate people who are not elect are then just not being interceded for, like, you know.
That is a good question. Although maybe at this point I could just take the Thomistic position. Well, in any case, well, I'm not going to just ad hocly choose a position because it benefits me in a scriptural debate. But in any case, I think your point was well made here. So I'm not going to touch too much on that. I think that is still a relevant verse because it does touch on Peter uniquely, but I'm going to have to look more into that.
And the other part, if you do want to comment on this, if you don't, that's fine. But the whole, like, I feel like you're putting way too much weight on that whole, that your faith not fail. Because I think it's talking about the context of in this whole, like, the situation that he's about to find himself in. But you're not only saying sort of him for all time, but also his office, the people who follow him in this particular office for all time.
So I'm going to push back here. This has to be read in light of So this has to be read in the unity of Scripture in light of Matthew 16. In other words, I'm saying Matthew 16 should be given heavier weight because it rectifies this tension that goes on in this specific passage. In the same way I was speaking about Isaiah. I'm not saying that you can interpret the whole papacy out of this. I'm not citing this as evidence, just background knowledge.
Oh no, I'm not even saying. No, I agree that you're not saying that. But like, if I were to see this prayer or this verse about Matthew, I wouldn't say, oh, wait a minute, does that mean that Matthew never, fell into heresy, or that the office of people under his episcopate fell into heresy? Like, that wouldn't be a second thought for me.
What would be?
It wouldn't be a second thought for me. Like, I wouldn't be thinking those sorts of things. I'd be like, well, Jesus prayed that his faith would not fail, that he would return back to the faith, after his betrayal. Like that's all that I would read. I would see no reason to dig beyond that. I would say
I'll push back on this one because I think that's important. So when your faith fails, it fails. Like, a failure just means it fails to meet its specific end or goal. Now, Peter's faith did obviously fail in this one. I don't see how you can read, like, in the immediate context of what happens, as anything but a failure of Peter the person. And whether that's extended to the office or not, like again, that's a debate for another day. But I am going to say here that no, this is, if you can call a sin a failure, it's definitely denying Christ 3 times in front of all people for all to see. So I think I would place a lot of emphasis on that.
No, I don't think you're understanding my point. Like, my point being that if I were to read this with like Jesus was talking about Matthew or about John or about Paul or something like that, and not about Peter.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Like, I wouldn't say, oh, wait a minute. Now, why is he saying that? Is there some sort of infallibility or super office? Like none of that would come into mind. I think the only reason why it comes across as the only reason why one is holding to such a thing is they see the word Peter and they see strength or faith not fail, and like adding Matthew 16:18, a particular interpretation of that into it.
Right, because he was also, because if you look at that verse, it also spoke of his role in relationship to the apostles, did it not?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why if it just dealt with Peter as a person and as an individual, apart from his role to the apostles, then you'd make a stronger case. But there is some kind of relationship relative to the rest of the apostles themselves. So that's why the emphasis has to be placed there a little. Now, let's assume that it wasn't Peter, it was Matthew, and it wasn't in relationship to any of the apostles. You would have a good point. But in light of the connection that Peter has to the apostles, which is specifically made in the verse, I do definitely see a tension that's taking place there. And
so what do you think it supports then? Let me ask you that. Like Luke 23, because my thought was that you were trying to show that this gives evidence, significant evidence of some sort to papal infallibility or never erring or anything,
no, I would say that the distinction between Peter and his office is there, and that where Peter as an individual might fail, it's better understood that Peter in relationship to his office and to the apostles would not fail, given what happens afterwards. So I think that we both believe in the inspiration of Scripture, right? The idea that, right, I would think that that specific context in which Jesus said it in relationship to the events that take place afterwards works as kind of an indicator that he's not speaking about Peter's personal faith and in his life, but rather in relationship to the other apostles, that it would not fail. So, so that distinction is helpful so as to avoid any tension that's going to follow afterwards between the two. That's kind of what I want to emphasize here. That distinction. Now, you might not think that distinction is necessary because it's possible for Christ to pray for you, that you might fall away, and that it wouldn't be a mark against Christ. That I understand. I don't. I would push back though to say that it had no relationship to Peter in his role in relationship to the other apostles. I think that much might be a stretch.
Okay. Yeah, but you do know also that I hold to St. Peter being the head of the apostles, and that I'm even okay with, although I don't think it's mandated by Scripture at all, a sort of prima inter pares, which would not be allowed for Roman Catholics today. But yeah.
Well, so right now,
or primus inter pares. Primus inter pares.
No.
My Latin's. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, you'd recognize that there's a distinction between the man and the office too. But something that has to be noted here is that Peter's faith, Peter holding the office isn't dependent upon his faith. Peter just has the office, and Christ says, "The gates of hell shall not triumph against thee." So there is something to the office which is protected, all things considered. At the very least, it seems to come across that way.
Yeah, no. My whole point about the office part is that it wouldn't be mandated by Scripture. So I'm saying I wouldn't find it a particular unique office in Scripture. Yeah.
In any case, I think we kind of beat this portion over
the
head.
I didn't want to get into a debate. Yeah, I was trying to not get into much of a debate with it.
All right, but although in the future I am going to just I am going to rethink my theology in terms of God's will and in terms of his positive will and his permissive will. Just to emphasize a more coherent theology. Maybe the verse will make more sense in light of it, maybe less sense, but hopefully it comes across as being me coming to the truth.
You know what? Maybe I didn't tell you about this beforehand, but I guess I could do it now. Would you ever want to debate annihilationism?
Ooh, yes, actually, I would. That is a position that I've never investigated itself. So, give me a couple of months to look at it. But I'm going to just say this right here. If I really just don't see this as a tenable position at all. No offense. Here's the thing. If I got to debate,
throw me your best verse or whatever, or your best whatever.
Oh, the one in Judas about the one in the book of Judith concerning the lament of the nations and their eternal.
Oh, I'm so accustomed to talking with Protestants about this. I'd have to remember what that passage is.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Within the Protestant, what's generally known as the Protestant canon, which is not including the Judeo canon. I would say there is not a single passage that has a problem for it.
How about the verses in the book in the Apocalypse of John that speak of being thrown into the lake of fire?
Yeah, no. We so. I mean, I'm debating if I should get into this right now or not. But yeah, so in Revelation.
Okay, I'm just going to say this much: we won't go any further here, but I'll ask you this one question, and then we'll close on this. What do you think is the best verse against your position? And why don't you think that holds up? What is the best verse in favor of hell, an eternal perpetual torment, and you still don't think holds up?
I honestly can't think of any. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I really can't think of any. There are
How long have you?
not any.
Okay, Chris
I'm
State, let's
sorry.
move on. Okay, Chris State, let's move
Since like
on.
2012, I've been an annihilationist. It's so difficult to think of a single passage that really helps the annihilationist position, or I mean the eternal conscious torment position. Like
Well,
I think what happens is I never, yeah, it's just it's I don't I, and I'm not trying to be whatever. Like even with the Revelation ones, the fact is maybe what was it, Revelation 14:6, I think, maybe that one. But when you're looking at what the book of Revelation is, and when you look at the fact that the angel himself gives the interpretation of what this imagery is, like the angel himself says, the imagery you're seeing before you, like he doesn't say that in those exact words, but the imagery you're seeing before you is the second death. And we know that like we're not going to see a vampiric whore at some point, riding on top of a beast with a 7-headed 10-horned dragon. We know that those are images depicting things. And when we have the interpretation given to us by within Scripture, we take the interpretation as literal, not the imagery as literal. So like you'll have like Revelation 21 or whatever it is, in the imagery, they're being thrown to the lake of fire and they're tormented day and night and all that sort of stuff. But then the interpretation from the angel is this imagery you're seeing, it's the second death. Like it's an imagery showing you like, well, not showing you, but like it's imagery. It's apocalyptic imagery of the second death. So I'm going to take the second death, the interpretation, as literal. I'm going to take the imagery, the apocalyptic imagery, as figurative. And what I see is they take it the exact opposite. They say, no, second death, it doesn't really mean second death. It just means second, well, we're separated from God, although God is the source of all life. So you're kind of not separated from God because you still have to be connected to him. Otherwise, you don't have life. Mm-hmm. And you're being tormented for all eternity. So it's not quite a death, but it's kind of a death, but not really. Like that whole thing. It doesn't make sense.
Okay, all right. How about I throw this one verse? I actually found the one in Judith I was thinking of.
Okay.
Woe to the nations that rise up against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in the day of judgment. Fire and worms he will give to their flesh. They shall weep in pain forever.
I'd have to look into the Greek of it.
Okay.
Yeah, to be fair, the question is what is the word used for forever? Ionios is probably what it is, or a form of it. My Greek is not that great right now. And I'm not going to put too much weight on this, but Ionios does not always mean forever.
Right.
It means an age, and I would actually hold to the understanding of torment happening within the intermediate state.
Okay.
All right. So when I look at Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus, I'm not necessarily committed to that being a sort of literal image of what's happening, but I'm not opposed to it either. Like that is consistent with my understanding of hell, because that's Hades. That's not the final state.
And okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, if we ever do debate this, I will be using that passage. I think it's a really good one. And to be fair, a lot of
Judith, what?
Oh,
sorry.
Let's see. Was it? Oh, Judith 16:17.
All right, I'll look that up. I'll look into it.
It's a really good passage. Although I guess annihilationists don't really have to deal with this problem because, as you said, Catholic will use the Deuterocanon.
Most annihilationists are Protestant because we haven't had a sort of dogmatic confessional position. What's really interesting is that one of the reasons I became Anglican was that I, as a Baptist, I was an annihilationist, and I had to be very secretive about it, which is not necessarily a good thing. But I was teaching a Sunday school class, and I asked my pastor, I told him, I don't believe in once saved, always saved. Is that going to be a problem? He paused for a bit, and then he was like, as long as you don't teach that, you can that you reject once saved, always saved, you can still be a teacher. And that was like my little test to see how he would react if I told people I was an annihilationist.
Ooh, that's
And
worse.
yeah, which is obviously worse and all that. So I was like, okay, yeah. And that was sort of the last straw for me that got me into Anglicanism.
No,
But I told my priest, I told my priest about it. And I asked him, I'm like, is this going to be something that is an impediment to my ordination? And he goes, well, I would like for that to be true, the theology of annihilationism. I don't think, I'm not convinced, but it's not against the formularies, and it is adiaphora. So, just don't be dogmatic about it. And it didn't interrupt my ordination whatsoever.
I guess I could just tell you a controversial theological belief I have as a Catholic, although I don't think it's contrary to the faith. The prayer of Manassas?
Yes.
I actually think that should be counted as sacred scripture. Can't bind anyone to it, but yeah. We actually say
I thought you guys did.
Nope. It's no, I don't think so.
We have it in our prayer book or in our Bible.
Yeah, it's actually not.
I'm almost positive we do. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I mean, even in the Byzantine Rite, we actually do read it at times, but it's not considered canonical. Yeah, it's beautiful. I actually have a remix of it. I actually have a remix reading of it on my channel. If anyone's interested,
That's just another reason for you to become Anglican. There. We have the prayer of Manassas in our Bible.
I have it too. First off, I have it as well. Secondly, even I would just become Eastern Orthodox again. There's no offense. There's nothing really that Anglicanism offers that I couldn't get as an EO. Although I probably have to be secretive about my scholastic leanings. But what can you do?
Yeah. No. Same thing with me for Eastern Orthodoxy, because I get a lot of. Aside from the rad trad Romans, I get a lot of Easterners who are like, "Oh, why don't you become us?" Kind of thing. I'm like, I tell people, I'm already Western Orthodox as an Anglican. They don't like that.
Yeah, although
it's when I say I'm already Catholic as an Anglican, Romans don't like that. So.
Yeah. Here's the. I don't know. I'll say this much: at least you wouldn't have any pushback in terms of your opinion on the validity of Anglican orders as being an Orthodox priest, although I guess you'd still have to be ordained unconditionally.
Yeah, and I wouldn't accept that. I would consider that to be sacrilege, which it would be.
Yeah. It had to be out. Although, out of curiosity, do you know, in terms of your lineage, whether or not there's any, what's it called?
Old Catholic orders?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's basically permeated all of the Anglican community. My understanding is.
I actually think
it's by now it has.
If that is the case, then you might be able to make a case for a conditional ordination.
I wouldn't want to. I have positive reasons for being Anglican. I have the closest thing I have to a positive reason for becoming Roman is that there is strength in having a singular head. But the position is way too strong that it's just too tyrannical, and I think it's way too problematic that way.
It's kind of weird.
I would be a Gallican. Is that what's called, right? Gallican? But it's heresy.
Yeah. Should have joined before the First Vatican Council.
Before I was born, yeah.
Exactly. Pull that miracle.
Yeah. No, but I the whole conciliarism would have been much better, but Vatican I says nope. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, in any case, one thing has to be kept in mind is this is why these conversations continue. Maybe you'll change your mind. Maybe I'll change my mind. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Only God knows.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for being on, and I guess we will kill the live stream. Anything before we kill it?
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the debate. I hope this is just a great example of how people can disagree but contribute in a very sporting manner. And I also hope that in the future, we just take the same amount of charity with one another as we've demonstrated here. And I don't just say that for me and you, James. I also say that for everyone who is listening, because these things can get heated. True
that. And I appreciate your good debate sparring partner person. And it's better than having to deal with rad trads or dishonest apologetic opponents, which I will not name any. But yeah, and it's glad that I'm glad that we can actually have more than just like me saying you worship Mary and then you saying you're your own pope. Like, I'm glad we're not having those debates.
To be fair, you could come on our side and you'd still be your own pope. I mean, I know a lot. I know a lot of tradies who, yeah,
who are their own popes.
All I'm saying is that's not.
I said it for you.
Thank you. All I'm saying is it's not definitely infallible teaching.
Oh well. All right. Peace.